The day Sarah Mitchell signed the deed for Willow Creek Farm with her last $500 and a trunk full of second-hand furniture, every resident of Riverside Valley wondered if grief had finally broken her judgment. In a community where generational farming knowledge determined success and bank loans required collateral she didn't have, this newly widowed city transplant with soil-free fingernails seemed destined for spectacular failure. What these weathered farmers and local officials couldn't possibly anticipate was that their greatest error wasn't questioning her determination. It was overlooking what lay hidden beneath the warped floorboards of that dilapidated farmhouse, and how quickly it would transform this desperate single mother into the most closely watched civilian in 3 counties when unmarked government vehicles began arriving before dawn. The pale morning light filtered through budding trees as Sarah Mitchell guided her aging sedan down the rutted drive toward Willow Creek Farm. Her son Ethan slept in the back seat, exhausted from the overnight drive that had brought them from their former apartment to this new beginning. Dust billowed behind the car, settling on the withered fields that stretched in every direction. The remnants of last season's failed crops still protruded from the soil like brittle memorials to the region's ongoing agricultural struggles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah parked before the weathered 2-story farmhouse that had once been white but had faded to a dull gray over decades of neglect. The wraparound porch sagged in several places, and shutters hung precariously from upstairs windows. The property had been abandoned for nearly 5 years, ever since old Walter Jenkins passed away, without heirs willing to take on a struggling farm during the region's worst agricultural decline in memory. "Mom, is this really ours?" Ethan asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he took in their new home with mixed curiosity and apprehension. "It is," Sarah affirmed, trying to infuse her voice with more confidence than she felt. "Every square foot of it. The house, the barn, and 20 acres of land." She didn't mention that the bank had practically given it away after failing to attract serious buyers for years, or that the $500 she'd paid represented quite literally everything they had left after her husband's medical bills and funeral expenses. In the 8 months since Mark's death, Sarah had learned that determination often had to substitute for resources. Her teaching position at an urban elementary school hadn't provided enough to keep their apartment once the medical collections began, and her mother's old stories about growing up on a farm in this valley had sparked a desperate idea. Land was cheap here now, and starting over somewhere with lower costs seemed their only option. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the overwhelming magnitude of what she'd taken on. Up close, the farmhouse looked even more daunting than in the real estate photos. Peeling paint, missing roof shingles, a porch that threatened to collapse under their weight as they carefully navigated toward the front door. "It needs some work," she admitted to Ethan, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to concern. "But we'll fix it up together, room by room. By the time school starts in autumn, you won't recognize the place." Whether she was trying to convince Ethan or herself remained unclear, even to Sarah. That afternoon, as they unpacked their meager belongings in the musty living room, a knock at the door startled them both. Sarah opened it to find an older man with a deeply sun-weathered face standing on her porch, a basket of assorted vegetables in his work-roughened hands. "Welcome to Riverside Valley," he said, offering the basket. "Frank Dawson. My family's farm borders yours to the west." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, accepting the gift with genuine gratitude. Fresh produce hadn't been in their budget for weeks. "And this is my son Ethan." Frank nodded to the boy, then surveyed the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling visible behind them. "Walter Jenkins let this place go in his final years. Been sitting empty since. Needs considerable work." "We're aware," Sarah replied, trying not to let defensiveness creep into her tone. "We're up for the challenge." Frank's expression remained neutral. Farming isn't just about buildings. Soil here hasn't produced properly in years. Most everyone's struggling, even those of us with generations of experience and equipment that works. Sarah straightened her shoulders slightly. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Dawson, but we have plans beyond traditional farming. My late husband was researching alternative agricultural methods before he passed. I intend to implement some of his ideas here. This wasn't entirely accurate. Mark had indeed been passionate about innovative farming techniques, often discussing them theoretically during their evenings together. But his work as an engineering consultant for environmental projects had never progressed to actual implementation. Sarah had only his scattered notes and half-formed concepts, plus whatever she could learn from online research using the town library's internet connection. Frank seemed to assess her with new interest. Alternative methods, you say? Well, Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah, please. Sarah, we've had plenty of outside experts come through promising miracle solutions. Agritech Solutions set up that modern facility at the edge of town 3 years ago, claiming their methods would revolutionize local agriculture. All they've done is buy up foreclosed farms and replace families with machinery. Sarah nodded, sensing both the warning and the test in his words. I'm not here representing any company, Mr. Dawson. It's just my son and me, trying to build something sustainable. We're not looking to revolutionize anything except our own circumstances. Something in her straightforward response seemed to satisfy him. Frank, he corrected. Everyone calls me Frank. He glanced at the ancient pickup truck in her yard, clearly noting the absence of farming equipment. Town's having its spring planting festival this weekend at the community center. Might be worth stopping by, meeting some folks. We'll be there, Sarah promised, recognizing both the invitation and the opportunity it represented. After Frank departed, Sarah and Ethan ate a simple dinner at their card table, the fresh vegetables a welcome addition to their packaged meals. Outside, darkness settled over Willow Creek Farm, the silence profound after years of city living. Mom, Ethan asked hesitantly, do you actually know how to farm? Sarah looked at her son, considering how much honesty was appropriate. Not yet, she finally admitted, but I'm a good learner, and so are you. We'll figure it out together. That night, after Ethan fell asleep in his sleeping bag, their furniture, delivery wouldn't arrive for days. Sarah explored the house more thoroughly with her flashlight. The wiring needed updating, the plumbing made alarming noises, and several floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. In what had once been Walter Jenkins' study, water damage had caused part of the wooden floor to warp and buckle. As she examined the damage, Sarah noticed that one section of floorboards seemed different from the others, newer perhaps, or at least less worn. Curious, she pressed against the area with her foot and felt a slight give. Kneeling, she discovered that several boards had been cut and replaced at some point, creating what appeared to be a concealed trapdoor. Sarah's heart quickened as she worked her fingers into a small gap at the edge. With effort, she lifted the section of flooring to reveal a small storage space beneath. Inside lay a metal lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, covered in decades of dust. The box was locked, but a small key had been taped to its underside, either surprising carelessness or an indication that its contents had been meant to be found eventually. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key and turned it. Inside lay several items: a leather-bound journal with yellowed pages, a small cloth pouch, and a sealed envelope with "For after I'm gone" written in faded ink. Sarah opened the envelope first, unfolding a handwritten letter dated nearly 30 years earlier. "To whoever finds this," it began in shaky handwriting, My name is Walter Jenkins, and what I've discovered on this land must be protected until someone understands its true importance. Sarah read with increasing astonishment as Walter described discovering something unusual while digging a new well in the North Field in 1979. The journal contained detailed notes, coordinates, and observations spanning decades. The cloth pouch held several small, unusual seed specimens, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, along with instructions for their cultivation. Walter's letter explained that he had spent years secretly studying these seeds, which produce plants with extraordinary properties, crops that could thrive in conditions where nothing else would grow, requiring minimal water while demonstrating remarkable resistance to disease and pests. Most incredibly, they seemed to gradually restore depleted soil to fertility through some unknown mechanism. The implications were staggering. If Walter's notes were accurate, these seeds could potentially address agricultural challenges, not just in Riverside Valley, but in struggling regions worldwide. Yet Walter had kept them hidden, growing test plots in remote corners of his property, documenting their properties but telling no one. The final paragraphs explained why, when he had cautiously shown samples to a university researcher in 1992, government officials had appeared at his farm within days, asking pointed questions about botanical anomalies and requesting access to his property for routine agricultural surveys. Spooked by their interest, Walter had destroyed his test plots, hidden his remaining seeds and research, and pretended ignorance. "I fear what would happen if these fell into the wrong hands," Walter wrote. "Corporations would patent and control them. Governments would weaponize their potential. I've waited for someone trustworthy to continue this work properly, but time is running out for me, and I have no heirs who care for this land. If you're reading this, perhaps you're the steward. These seeds have been waiting for. Use them wisely." Sarah sat back against the wall, Walter's journal clutched to her chest, her mind racing. She had come to Riverside Valley with nothing but desperation and her husband's unfulfilled dreams. Now she held what might be an agricultural miracle. And, if Walter's fears were justified, potentially a significant security concern that would attract exactly the kind of attention he had spent decades avoiding. What would she do with this discovery? The responsible choice might be contacting authorities, but Walter's warning gave her pause. The practical consideration was also undeniable. If these seeds performed as described, they could save her farm and possibly her new community. Before involving anyone else, she needed to verify Walter's claims herself. That decision made, Sarah carefully replaced everything in the lockbox except for a small sample of seeds and the most recent journal entries. She returned the box to its hiding place and secured the floorboards, then spent hours reading Walter's meticulous notes by flashlight until exhaustion finally overtook her. Saturday morning dawned clear and mild as Sarah and Ethan prepared for the planting festival. She had said nothing to her son about her discovery, uncertain how much a 10-year-old should be burdened with secrets. Instead, she had spent dawn hours examining the seeds more carefully in natural light. They appeared ordinary at first glance, resembling wheat, but with subtle differences in color and texture that became apparent only upon close inspection. Walter's notes indicated that early spring was ideal for planting. After seeing Ethan occupied with unpacking his books, Sarah had slipped out to a small, secluded garden plot behind the kitchen and carefully planted a dozen seeds according to Walter's instructions. Whatever came next, she needed evidence before making any claims or decisions. "Ready for the festival?" she asked Ethan as they climbed into their car. Her son nodded, though his enthusiasm seemed muted. The move had been hardest on him. New town, no friends yet, and the profound absence of his father still raw for them both. The Riverside Valley Community Center hummed with activity when they arrived. Long tables covered with checkered cloths, displayed homemade foods and preserves from better harvests past. Children darted between displays of agricultural equipment while adults clustered in conversation groups, their expressions collectively concerned despite the festive atmosphere. Sarah immediately felt the curious stares as she and Ethan entered. Newcomers were evidently rare in Riverside Valley, especially those who purchased property rather than selling it. Frank Dawson spotted them from across the room and waved them over to a group that included several other farmers. "Folks, this is Sarah Mitchell, Walter Jenkins Place's new owner," Frank announced, "and her son, Ethan." Sarah recognized the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their expressions. A middle-aged woman in practical attire extended her hand. "First, Maggie Cooper. I run the general store in town, known the Jenkins farm my whole life." Her handshake was firm, her assessment direct, but not unkind. "That property's been neglected a long while. What brings you to take it on?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "A fresh start," she said simply. "The opportunity to build something sustainable for my son. Land was beyond our reach in the city." "Farming experience?" asked a tall, lean man who introduced himself as Tom Wilson. "Limited," Sarah admitted, "but I'm a quick study, and I have some specific ideas for smaller scale operations to start." "Smaller scale doesn't pay bills around here anymore," commented an older woman named Elaine Peterson. "That's why half the county is either selling to agri-tech or leaving altogether." Sarah noticed a well-dressed man observing their conversation from several feet away. Unlike the farmers with their practical clothes and weathered features, he wore a crisp button-down shirt and maintained a careful distance from the community gathering while clearly monitoring it. Frank followed her gaze. "Robert Chambers," he explained quietly, "Agritech CEO. Shows up at these events to assess which farms might soon become available for the right price." As if sensing their attention, Chambers approached, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Ms. Mitchell, welcome to Riverside Valley. Robert Chambers, Agritech Solutions. Your purchase of the Jenkins property has created quite the buzz." "Has it?" Sarah replied, shaking his hand briefly. "Absolutely. Not many people invest in struggling agricultural land these days, especially without farming background." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "If you find the challenges overwhelming, my company would be happy to discuss options. We're always looking to expand our sustainable farming initiative." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Chambers, but we're committed to making this work." "Admirable," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Though I should mention that soil quality testing in that sector indicates significant depletion. Our analysis suggests at least 5 years of intensive remediation before commercial viability might be restored." Sarah felt a chill at his specific knowledge of her property's soil conditions. "You've studied my land?" "Regional analysis," he clarified smoothly. "Standard procedure for agricultural planning. Nothing specific to your property, of course." Before Sarah could respond, Mayor Patricia Jenkins, no relation to Walter despite the shared surname, called the gathering to order for the official commencement of planting season. As attention shifted to the ceremony, Chambers excused himself, but not before adding, "My office is always open if you reconsider, Ms. Mitchell. The first year tends to be illuminating for newcomers." Throughout the remainder of the festival, Sarah met more community members, some openly dubious of her prospects, others cautiously welcoming. She carefully steered conversations toward local agricultural challenges, gathering information while revealing little about her own plans. Ethan had found a few children his age and seemed momentarily distracted from their circumstances. A small victory Sarah cherished. As afternoon faded toward evening, they prepared to leave with promises to attend church the next morning, another opportunity to integrate into the community. "What did you think?" Sarah asked Ethan on the drive home. He considered the question with the seriousness that had become more pronounced since his father's death. "They don't think we can do it," he finally said, "but they don't know what Dad taught us." Sarah smiled at her son's loyalty, even as guilt twisted inside her. Mark had indeed been passionate about theoretical agricultural innovation, but his actual expertise had been in environmental engineering, not practical farming. She was banking on his scattered notes and her own determination to sustain this fiction, at least until she could assess Walter's seeds. As they crested the hill approaching their property, Sarah slowed the car abruptly. A black SUV with government plates was parked in their driveway, and two men in suits stood on the porch, knocking at their door. "Stay in the car," she instructed. Ethan, her mouth suddenly dry. How could anyone know about Walter's seeds already? She'd only found them last night and told no one. Approaching cautiously, Sarah called out, "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Both men turned. The older one stepped forward, presenting credentials. "Major David Reynolds, United States Army Intelligence. This is Lieutenant Harper. Are you Sarah Mitchell, current owner of this property?" Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "We'd like to ask you some questions about this land and its previous owner, Walter Jenkins. May we come inside?" "May I ask what this is concerning?" Sarah countered, stalling while her mind raced through possibilities. "Routine follow-up on several properties in this region," Reynolds replied smoothly. "Nothing to be concerned about. We're particularly interested in surveying activities that took place here during the 1970s and 80s. The specificity sent alarm through Sarah. This matched exactly when Walter had discovered the seeds, according to his journal. "I just purchased this property days ago," she said carefully. "I'm afraid I don't have any historical information that would help you." Reynolds studied her with an intensity that suggested he was weighing her words carefully. "Have you noticed anything unusual about the property, Mrs. Mitchell? Any structures or items left by the previous owner that seemed out of place?" "Just decades of neglect," Sarah replied, working to keep her voice steady. "The place needs considerable renovation." The lieutenant had been surveying the property while they spoke, his attention now fixed on the small garden area where Sarah had planted Walter's seeds that morning. "Recent planting?" he inquired casually, too casually. "Just a small vegetable garden for my son and me," Sarah explained. "Nothing special." Reynolds nodded, though skepticism showed in his expression. "We'll need to conduct a more formal survey of the property, particularly the Northfield area. Standard procedure for our geological assessment. Would tomorrow be convenient?" The Northfield, exactly where Walter had indicated finding the original seeds. This couldn't be coincidence. "I'm afraid we have plans tomorrow," Sarah improvised. "Church, then community introductions. Perhaps later in the week. I'd like to be present for any surveys, naturally." "Naturally," Reynolds agreed, though tension had entered his demeanor. "Tuesday, then. We'll return with the proper equipment." He handed her a business card. "Please contact me if you discover anything unusual before then. Historical artifacts, documentation, anything that seems significant." As the men departed, Sarah watched their vehicle disappear down the long driveway, her mind in turmoil. Whatever Walter had discovered decades ago was clearly still of interest to the government. She now had approximately 48 hours to decide whether to trust these officials, destroy the evidence as Walter had done, or find another path forward. That night, after ensuring Ethan was asleep, Sarah returned to Walter's journals, reading more carefully. The seeds he documented began, showing results within days, far faster than normal agricultural growth. If she could see evidence of their unusual properties before the officials returned, she'd have more information to make her decision. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn and slipped out to check the garden. What she saw stopped her breath. Tiny green shoots had already emerged from the soil. Growth that should have taken days had happened overnight. By Tuesday, there would be no hiding what she'd planted. Returning inside, Sarah found Ethan in the kitchen, attempting to prepare breakfast with their limited supplies. "Mum, why were those men here yesterday?" he asked, his perception sharper than she sometimes credited. Sarah hesitated, then made a decision. Ethan had already endured the loss of his father and their former life. She wouldn't burden him with more secrets and fears. "They're conducting surveys of farmland in the area," she said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Government assessments to help address the agricultural problems." Ethan seemed to accept this explanation, and they prepared for church, another opportunity to establish themselves in the community and perhaps gain insights that might help navigate their increasingly complicated situation. Riverside Valley Community Church occupied a white clapboard building at the town's center. As Sarah and Ethan entered, they again felt the weight of curious stares, though several families from the festival offered friendly greetings. They took seats near the back, beside Maggie Cooper from the general store. "Settling in all right," Maggie whispered as the service began. "Getting there," Sarah replied. "Though we had some unexpected visitors yesterday, government officials asking about the property's history." Maggie's expression shifted subtly. "What kind of officials?" "Military intelligence, asking about surveys from the 1970s and 80s. Maggie was silent for a moment, then whispered, "Walter always claimed the government was interested in his land for reasons they wouldn't explain. Most folks thought he was getting paranoid in his later years." The service proceeded, but Sarah's mind remained fixed on her predicament. After the final hymn, as congregants gathered for coffee, Frank Dawson approached with Tom Wilson. "Heard you had visitors yesterday," Frank said without preamble. News traveled fast in small communities. "Word gets around," Sarah acknowledged. "Those same types came around years back," Tom offered, "after Walter claimed to have found something unusual on his property. Never said what. They surveyed, declared nothing of interest. But Walter was never the same afterward, more secretive. Started letting the farm decline not long after." Sarah calculated her next move carefully. These men clearly knew something about Walter's past, but she wasn't ready to reveal what she'd found, not without understanding more about the community dynamics and whom she could trust. "They're coming back Tuesday for a formal survey," she said, "particularly interested in the North Field." Frank and Tom exchanged glances. "That's where Walter's well project failed," Frank noted. He'd been digging for a new water source, then suddenly abandoned the whole thing, covered everything up, and never spoke of it again. This aligned with Walter's journal entries about his discovery. Sarah was about to probe further when she noticed Robert Chambers from Agritech entering the church, making his way directly toward their group. "Ms. Mitchell," he greeted her with practiced warmth, "I understand you've had interest from our friends in government. Geological surveys can be quite disruptive to planning your first planting season." The fact that Chambers already knew about the military visit confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that information in Riverside Valley traveled through established channels, and that Agritech monitored those channels closely. "Just routine, I'm told," Sarah replied non-committally. "Of course," Chambers smiled, "though in my experience, when military intelligence shows interest in agricultural land, it's rarely routine. Should their findings create complications for your plans, remember, my offer stands." As Chambers moved on to speak with others, Frank leaned closer to Sarah. "Agritech's been trying to acquire Walter's land for years. Only parcel in that section they don't already control. Old Walter refused to sell even when he could barely keep the lights on." This new piece of information added another layer to Sarah's considerations. Whatever Walter had discovered, it had attracted both government and corporate interest. The question remained, which, if either, could be trusted with something potentially revolutionary? By the time Sarah and Ethan returned home that afternoon, she had formulated the beginnings of a plan. Rather than waiting passively for Tuesday's inspection, she would take a more proactive approach. Walter's journals contained decades of observations and experiments. If his claims about the seed's beneficial properties were accurate, this information needed protection, not just from government control, but from corporate exploitation as well. While Ethan worked on setting up his bedroom, Sarah returned to the garden where she'd planted Walter's seeds. The sprouts had grown visibly even in the hours they'd been at church, now standing nearly an inch tall. Growth that should have taken a week under optimal conditions. She carefully documented this with her phone's camera, then checked the journals for Walter's observations about early growth patterns. Her findings matched his precisely. That evening, Sarah made a decision. Keeping secrets from both officials and the community would only make her position more precarious. She needed allies, but choosing them would require careful judgment. Monday morning, she drove into town alone, leaving Ethan to organize his books and toys in his new room. Her first stop was Cooper's General Store, where she found Maggie restocking shelves. "Need something?" Maggie asked, noting Sarah's determined expression. "Information, actually," Sarah replied quietly, "about Walter Jenkins and why both the military and agritech seem so interested in his land." Maggie glanced around to ensure no other customers were within earshot. "Walter helped my family during the drought of '85, when everyone else's crops failed. Never explained how his fields stayed productive, just shared what he had and asked no recognition." She studied Sarah intently. "You found something, didn't you?" Rather than answering directly, Sarah asked if Walter had discovered something that could help this community, something that powerful interests might want to control. Who here would he have trusted? Maggie didn't hesitate. Frank Dawson. Those two had differences over the years, but Frank's the most honest man in the county. Turned down Agritech's offers even when he could barely make mortgage payments. Sarah nodded, having sensed as much in her limited interactions with Frank. "And Tom Wilson?" "Tom's solid," Maggie confirmed. "Lost his wife to cancer 3 years back. Been raising those kids alone, fighting to keep his farm productive. No love for corporations or government overreach." With this confirmation of her own instincts, Sarah drove directly to Frank's farm. She found him repairing an ancient tractor, grease-stained hands working methodically on the engine. "Need a hand with something at your place?" he asked, wiping his palms on a rag as she approached. "More like advice," Sarah replied, "and possibly help with a decision that affects more than just my family." Frank's weathered features registered both curiosity and caution. "Sounds serious." "It might be," Sarah acknowledged. "Could we talk somewhere private and maybe ask Tom Wilson to join us?" An hour later, Sarah sat at Frank's kitchen table with both men. Walter's journal open before them, several of the unusual seeds arranged on a clean white cloth. She had explained her discovery, Walter's decades of research, and the apparent interest from both military intelligence and agritech. "Walter always was secretive about his methods," Frank said, examining the seeds with careful fingers. "Especially after those government folks came around in '92, started letting fields go fallow that had been productive for years. We all thought he'd given up." "He was protecting this," Sarah explained. "According to his notes, these seeds gradually restore soil fertility while requiring minimal water and resisting common agricultural diseases. He was afraid of what would happen if they fell into the wrong hands." "And now you've planted some," Tom observed, concern evident in his voice. Sarah nodded. "Just a small test garden, but they're already showing accelerated growth. By tomorrow's inspection, there will be no hiding what they are." "If these perform as Walter claimed, they could save every farm in this valley," Frank said, the implications dawning on him. But I understand his concerns. Companies like Agritech would patent them, control their distribution, make farmers dependent on their supply chain. And the military's interest suggests potential applications beyond agriculture, Tom added. Anything that can thrive in harsh conditions has strategic value. So, what do I do? Sarah asked. The inspection is tomorrow. I found something that could help my family and possibly this community, but I don't know whom to trust with it. Frank was silent for a long moment, then asked, "Why did you come to us? You barely know anyone here." Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because everything I've learned about Walter suggests he valued this community above potential profit or recognition. And you both seem to share those values." The men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Here's what we know," Frank finally said. "Agritech's been buying up land around Walter's property systematically for years. They've drilled test wells, conducted soil samples far beyond what's needed for normal agricultural planning. They want something specific in that area. And the military's periodic interest suggests they know something too," Tom added. "But they've never moved to claim the land through eminent domain or other means they could easily employ. It's as if both sides are watching and waiting," Frank concluded, "neither wanting to show too much interest and reveal what they know." Sarah processed this, seeing the situation with new clarity. So tomorrow, when they inspect and find the growing plants, everything changes, Frank confirmed. Whatever delicate balance has existed breaks. They'll know someone has rediscovered what Walter was hiding. As the afternoon light began to fade, the three of them formulated a plan. One that would require community trust, careful timing, and considerable risk. Sarah would need allies beyond just these two men if she hoped to protect Walter's discovery while ensuring it benefited those who needed it most. When Sarah returned home, she found Ethan sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the neglected fields in golden light. "Mom," he said without preamble, "I found something weird in the garden. The plants you put in yesterday are already huge." Sarah sat beside her son, placing an arm around his shoulders. "I know. That's part of what makes this place special. Is that why those men are coming back tomorrow?" Sarah studied her son's face, recognizing the perceptiveness that sometimes made parenting him both challenging and rewarding. "Yes," she admitted. "And I need to tell you something important about our new home and what's going to happen next." As darkness settled over Willow Creek Farm, lights appeared on the distant road, not the expected headlights of a single vehicle, but the steady approach of multiple cars and trucks. The community of Riverside Valley was arriving, summoned by Frank and Tom's calls, ready to stand with the newcomer who had discovered what might be their collective salvation. By morning, military intelligence would indeed arrive to find something unexpected at the long-neglected Jenkins farm. Not just evidence of Walter's miraculous seeds, but an entire community united in protecting them, and a single mother prepared to ensure they served the many rather than enriching the few. Sarah Mitchell had spent her last $500 on an abandoned farm, seeking merely shelter and a fresh start. What she'd found instead was something far more valuable: purpose, community, and the seeds of hope for a future that had seemed impossibly distant just days before. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Farm, with golden light streaming through the kitchen windows. Sarah Mitchell watched through the parted curtains as the first vehicles appeared on the horizon, right on schedule. Major Reynolds and his team would be arriving for their promised inspection at 9 o'clock sharp. But Sarah and her unexpected allies had been awake for hours, preparing. The previous night's impromptu gathering had evolved into something Sarah could never have anticipated when she'd first discovered Walter's lockbox. Frank Dawson had reached out to trusted neighbors who contacted others until nearly 20 local farmers had assembled in her weathered living room. There, under the flickering light of newly installed bulbs, Sarah had shared Walter's journals, the extraordinary seeds, and the remarkable growth already visible in her test garden. The farmer's initial skepticism had transformed to astonishment, then determination as they recognized what Walter's discovery might mean for their struggling community. By midnight, they had formulated a plan that was either brilliant or desperate, possibly both. "They're coming up the drive," Tom Wilson announced, stepping in from the porch where he'd been keeping watch. 3 vehicles. Government plates. Sarah nodded, smoothing her hands over her work jeans with deliberate calm. "Everyone ready?" Around her kitchen, 6 community members nodded back: Frank, Tom, Maggie Cooper, and 3 other respected local farmers. The rest were positioned strategically around the property, appearing to go about ordinary agricultural preparations. A casual observer would see nothing unusual about farmers helping a newcomer prepare her land for spring planting. Except, of course, for what was happening in the small garden behind the kitchen. Sarah had explained everything to Ethan the night before, a simplified version appropriate for a 10-year-old, but honest nonetheless. He now sat at the kitchen table with his notebook, tasked with documenting everything that happened, like Dad used to do with his projects, she'd told him, giving his curiosity purposeful direction while keeping him safely inside. The sound of car doors slamming announced their visitor's arrival. Sarah stepped onto the porch just as Major Reynolds and Lieutenant Harper approached, accompanied by a woman in civilian clothes carrying scientific equipment. "Mrs. Mitchell," Reynolds greeted her with practiced formality. "I appreciate your accommodation of our schedule. This is Dr. Garcia, our environmental assessment specialist." "Major Reynolds," Sarah replied with equal formality. "I've invited some neighbors to assist with preparations for my first planting season. I hope that won't interfere with your survey." Reynolds glanced at the farmers visible in various locations around the property, his expression revealing momentary surprise before returning to professional neutrality. "Not at all. We'll work around your helpers." "Coffee before you start?" Sarah offered, following the script they'd agreed upon. "It's been brewing fresh since dawn." "That would be welcome," Reynolds acknowledged after a brief hesitation. As Sarah led the 3 officials into her kitchen, she felt the weight of what was about to unfold. The government team found themselves entering not an empty farmhouse, but a gathering of weathered, serious-faced local farmers, each one radiating the quiet authority that comes from generations working the same land. Quite the welcome committee, Reynolds observed as introductions were made, his casual tone belied by the alertness in his posture. "Neighborly help," Frank explained simply. "Tradition around here when someone new takes on a struggling property." Sarah poured coffee for everyone, the mundane ritual contrasting sharply with the tension filling the room. Through the window, she could see other members of Reynolds' team beginning to unload equipment from their vehicles. "So," Sarah said, setting down her own cup, "what exactly are you looking for in your survey today, Major? Your explanation yesterday was somewhat general." Reynolds studied her over the rim of his mug. "Standard assessment. Soil composition, groundwater quality, geographical anomalies." "Geological or botanical?" Tom asked innocently. The slight narrowing of Reynolds' eyes confirmed their suspicions. "Both, when warranted. The military maintains interest in agricultural viability for national security purposes." "Of course," Frank nodded. "Though it's interesting that your particular interest seems focused on Walter Jenkins' property rather than the entire valley." "We're surveying multiple properties," Dr. Garcia interjected, speaking for the first time. "This is one stop among many." "Yet you specifically mentioned the North Field," Sarah pointed out, "and surveys from the 1970s and 80s, almost as if you were looking for something specific. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly as the pretense of casual conversation evaporated. Reynolds set down his cup with deliberate care. "Mrs. Mitchell, I believe it would be best if we proceeded with our official business. While I appreciate the hospitality, this is a matter of national security," Sarah finished for him. "Yes, you've implied as much. But here's what puzzles me, Major. Walter Jenkins discovered something on this land decades ago, something that attracted government attention then and clearly still does now. Yet instead of claiming the land through legal channels available to the federal government, you've allowed it to sit abandoned for years, only to appear immediately after I purchased it." Reynolds' expression hardened. "I'm not at liberty to discuss specific intelligence matters, but I strongly advise cooperation with our survey today. Obstruction would be problematic." "No one's obstructing anything," Frank said mildly. "We're just curious why the military is so interested in seeds." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Reynolds and Garcia exchanged quick glances. Confirmation. Enough of their true purpose. "I don't know what you're referring to," Reynolds stated, though his tone had lost its certainty. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew a small cloth pouch, identical to the one in Walter's lockbox, but not the same one. She placed it on the table between them. "Walter Jenkins discovered unusual seeds on this property in 1979, she said calmly. He documented their extraordinary properties for decades while keeping them hidden from authorities who showed unusual interest without explanation. I found his research 2 days ago, along with sample specimens." The change in Reynolds was immediate and dramatic. Gone was the pretense of routine survey work, replaced by focused intensity. "Those seeds represent a potential breakthrough in agricultural resilience," Dr. Garcia said, abandoning the fiction as well. "They could have significant implications for food security in changing climate conditions. And military applications in austere environments," Sarah added. "Which is why you're here, rather than the Department of Agriculture." Reynolds didn't deny it. "Mrs. Mitchell, those seeds and any related research materials need to be properly secured and studied by qualified experts with appropriate clearance." "I have the authority to..." "To what?" Maggie Cooper interrupted. "Confiscate private property without explanation or compensation. Classify a natural resource so it benefits military contractors rather than struggling farmers." "This isn't a simple agricultural matter," Reynolds insisted. "The unusual properties of these specimens could have far-reaching implications beyond farming. National security concerns take precedence over local interests." Sarah leaned forward. "And that's precisely the problem, Major. Walter understood that whoever controlled these seeds would determine who benefited from them. He didn't trust the government to prioritize humanitarian applications over strategic ones." "What exactly are you proposing?" Reynolds asked, his voice lowered, but tension evident in every word. Sarah exchanged glances with Frank before responding. "A compromise. You want to study these seeds and understand their properties. We want to ensure they help revitalize our community and potentially others facing agricultural challenges worldwide." "Those aren't necessarily conflicting goals," Dr. Garcia suggested, earning a sharp look from Reynolds. "Except for classification. Protocols," Tom pointed out. "Military research tends to disappear behind security clearances for decades." Reynolds assessed the room, clearly recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond his expectations. "I need to make some calls," he finally said. "Of course," Sarah agreed, "but first I think you should see what we're actually discussing." She led the group through the kitchen and out the back door to the small garden area where she'd planted Walter's seeds just 2 days earlier. What had been tiny sprouts yesterday morning now stood nearly 8 inches tall, with unusual branching patterns already forming, growth that should have taken weeks compressed into days. Dr. Garcia gasped. audibly, immediately kneeling to examine the plants more closely. "Extraordinary," she murmured, withdrawing scientific instruments from her case. "The cellular structure must be fundamentally different to allow for this rate of development." Reynolds observed with more controlled reaction, though his intensity hadn't diminished. "How many people know about this?" "More than you might expect," Frank answered. As if on cue, the farmers positioned around the property began converging on the garden area, each one carrying small trays of seedlings identical to those growing in Sarah's test plot. "What is this?" Reynolds demanded, his professional composure finally cracking. Sarah gestured to the gathering farmers. "Last night, after confirming Walter's claims about growth rates, we divided a portion of the seeds among trusted community members. Each of these people planted their own test plots 12 hours ago. As you can see, the results are consistent with mine." Reynolds stared at the assembled farmers, each holding visible evidence of Walter's miracle, the strategic implications dawning on him. "You've deliberately proliferated a potential national security asset. We've ensured that no single entity can control this resource." Sarah corrected him. "It can't be classified or contained now that it exists in multiple locations under different stewardships." The standoff might have escalated further if not for the unexpected sound of approaching vehicles. All heads turned as 3 black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the farm's entrance, bearing the distinctive logo of Agritech Solutions. "And right on cue," Tom muttered. "Word travels fast." Robert Chambers emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by corporate security and what appeared to be scientific personnel. His confident stride faltered momentarily when he registered the assembly of local farmers and government officials around Sarah's garden. "Ms. Mitchell," he called as he approached, "I received word that there might be some discoveries of interest on your property. Agritech would be very interested in discussing development opportunities." Reynolds stepped forward, blocking Chambers' path. "This is an active government operation, Mr. Chambers. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Chambers smiled thinly. "Major Reynolds, isn't it? How interesting to find military intelligence involved in agricultural matters. My company has legitimate business interests in regional soil anomalies. We've been monitoring this area for years." "Monitoring?" Sarah questioned. "Or waiting for Walter Jenkins to either sell or pass away so you could acquire his discovery?" Chambers shifted his attention to her. "Walter rebuffed many generous offers, unfortunately. He never understood the infrastructure required to properly develop and distribute agricultural innovations. Agritech has the resources to maximize the potential of whatever you've found here. For shareholder profit," Frank added, "while charging desperate farmers premium prices for access to something that should belong to everyone." The tension in the air was palpable now, with 3 distinct factions converging around Sarah's modest garden. Military officials concerned with strategic applications, corporate interests seeking profit opportunities, and local farmers determined to protect their community's future. Sarah moved to stand directly between Reynolds and Chambers. "Gentlemen, the situation is straightforward. Walter Jenkins discovered these seeds decades ago. He documented their properties extensively while protecting them from those who would monopolize their benefits. I've inherited not just his property, but his responsibility." "And what do you intend to do with them?" Chambers asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Sarah had spent the night considering exactly this question. "The only thing that makes sense. These seeds and Walter's research will be placed in the public domain, available to researchers, farmers, and humanitarian organizations worldwide." "That's absolutely out of the question," Reynolds objected immediately. The security implications would be manageable if the military focused on constructive applications rather than weaponization or control, Sarah interrupted. Think of the humanitarian missions that could be enhanced by crops that grow in conflict zones with minimal resources. And the commercial potential would be squandered, Chambers argued. Development requires significant investment that only private enterprise can provide efficiently. Or it could be supported through public institutions, agricultural extensions, and international cooperation, Sarah countered. The point is, neither of you gets to make that decision unilaterally. Not anymore. She gestured to the farmers surrounding them, each with their seedling trays. As of this morning, Walters, discovery exists in 20 different locations across this county. Each person has agreed to share seeds with 2 trusted contacts beyond our immediate community by nightfall. The proliferation will continue geometrically. Reynolds looked genuinely alarmed. You can't possibly understand the ramifications of what you're doing. Actually, Major, I believe Mrs. Mitchell understands perfectly, came a new voice from beyond the assembled group. All heads turned to see an older woman in a well-tailored suit walking toward them, accompanied by 2 aides carrying briefcases. She moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to command rooms. Senator Catherine Harlow, she introduced herself, extending her hand first to Sarah. Chair of the Agricultural Committee and member of the Intelligence Oversight Board. When multiple unusual activities converge on a small farm in my state, my office tends to notice. Reynolds stiffened. Senator, this is a classified operation. Initiated without proper authorization or oversight, according to my information, Senator Harlow interrupted smoothly. Just as Mr. Chambers' corporate intelligence gathering appears to have overstepped certain legal boundaries regarding private property. Both men fell silent, reassessing the situation as the power dynamics shifted once again. The senator turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you've made a significant discovery on your property, one with potentially far-reaching implications. Yes, Senator, Sarah confirmed, though the credit belongs to Walter Jenkins. I merely found what he protected for decades. Senator Harlow nodded thoughtfully, and rather than seeking personal profit or surrendering it to either government or corporate control, you've chosen a more distributed approach to its stewardship. I believe that's what Walter would have wanted, Sarah said. These seeds could help revitalize not just this community, but agricultural regions worldwide facing similar challenges. That potential benefit shouldn't be restricted by patents, classified research protocols, or profit margins. The senator studied the unusual plants growing in Sarah's garden, then surveyed the determined faces of the assembled farmers with their seedling trays. A community solution to what others see as either a security asset or commercial opportunity. Interesting approach. It's the only approach that ensures the broadest benefit, Frank asserted. Senator Harlow seemed to come to a decision. Major, Reynolds, you'll stand down your operation pending a full review by my committee. Mr. Chambers, I suggest Agritech reconsider whatever aggressive acquisition strategy you've been pursuing in this region. Corporate espionage carries significant consequences when it intersects with national security matters. Both men began to protest, but the senator held up her hand. Alternatively, we could explore a more collaborative model. Mrs. Mitchell's approach has merit, particularly in its resistance to monopolization by any single entity. She turned back to Sarah. What would you say to the establishment of a public-private research initiative, one with appropriate oversight, to ensure both security concerns and community benefits are balanced? The Jenkins-Mitchell Seed Program, perhaps? Sarah hadn't anticipated this direction. I'm not interested in recognition, Senator. Not recognition, Mrs. Mitchell. Participation. Your perspective and that of this community would be essential to ensuring the program maintains its humanitarian focus alongside legitimate security applications. The proposition hung in the air as Sarah considered its implications. A collaborative approach could potentially address all concerns while preventing either government classification or corporate patenting from restricting access to Walter's discovery. I'd need assurances, Sarah said carefully, transparent governance, community representation, public domain status for core research. Reasonable terms, the senator agreed, which we can negotiate properly after my staff has helped document exactly what we're dealing with here. She gestured to her aides, who began opening their briefcases to reveal scientific equipment far more sophisticated than Dr. Garcia's field kit. The next several hours unfolded in a flurry of activity. Senator Harlow's intervention had transformed the standoff into an improvised research gathering. Military personnel, corporate scientists, local farmers, and government officials cautiously collaborated to document the properties of Walter's seeds under the watchful eyes of the senator's staff. Dr. Garcia worked alongside Agritech's botanists, their professional curiosity temporarily overriding institutional rivalries as they examined growth patterns and cellular structures. Reynolds maintained a perimeter with his team, still clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to directly challenge a senator's authority. By late afternoon, preliminary findings had confirmed Walter's most significant claims. The plants demonstrated unprecedented growth rates, extreme resource efficiency, and apparent soil-enhancing properties that defied conventional agricultural understanding. The implications are staggering, Dr. Garcia acknowledged, looking up from her microscope. These plants aren't just surviving with minimal resources, they're actively improving their growing environment. Regenerative agriculture beyond anything currently documented, agreed the lead Agritech scientist, professional excitement overcoming corporate restraint. Senator Harlow, who had been observing the various examinations while engaging with the local farmers about their experiences, finally called the impromptu gathering to order. I believe we've established the significance of what Mrs. Mitchell has discovered, she announced. The question now is how we proceed in a manner that respects multiple legitimate interests. She outlined a preliminary framework, a special research initiative with joint oversight from agricultural, environmental, and security agencies, alongside community representatives and academic institutions. Initial funding would come from federal sources, with corporate participation structured to prevent proprietary control. The core genetic material and Walter Jenkins' research will remain in the public domain, she emphasized, addressing Sarah's primary concern. Applications may be developed commercially, but the fundamental resource belongs to humanity, not any single entity. Reynolds still looked dissatisfied. Senator, there are security protocols which we will address appropriately, the senator assured him. But classification cannot be used as a tool to restrict humanitarian benefits. That's non-negotiable. Chambers, ever the pragmatist, had already begun calculating new opportunities within the proposed framework. Agritech would be prepared to contribute significant resources to development efforts, provided we maintain reasonable commercial rights to certain applications, which would be negotiated transparently, Senator Harlow affirmed, with community benefit requirements built into any licensing agreements. As the discussion continued, Sarah found herself standing somewhat apart, watching this unexpected outcome unfold. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save her son's future by purchasing an abandoned farm had somehow placed her at the center of something far larger. Frank joined her, his weathered face showing cautious optimism. "Not how I expected this day to go," he admitted quietly. Nor I, Sarah agreed. Do you think this can actually work? A genuine collaboration rather than a government takeover or corporate acquisition? Frank considered the question seriously, with the right oversight and enough public awareness to prevent backroom deals. Then maybe having a senator personally invested helps considerably. And the community involvement. That was your masterstroke, Frank acknowledged. By distributing the seeds last night, you ensured no one could simply seize control. Too many people know now. Too many locations to contain. Sarah watched as Ethan emerged cautiously from the house, notebook clutched in his hands, observing the transformed atmosphere with curiosity rather than fear. Her son approached one of the senator's aides, apparently asking questions about the scientific equipment, and was met with patient explanation rather than dismissal. Walter protected this discovery for decades because he didn't see a path forward. That wouldn't lead to exploitation, Sarah reflected. Maybe we've finally found that path. By evening, the unusual gathering began to disperse. Senator Harlow departed with preliminary agreements for a formal meeting in Washington the following week, where Sarah and selected community representatives would help establish the governance structure for the new initiative. Reynolds and his team withdrew their immediate survey plans, replaced by scheduled scientific assessments with transparent protocols. Even Chambers left with less predatory intentions than he'd arrived with, recognizing that collaboration now offered more potential than aggressive acquisition. As twilight settled over Willow Creek Farm, Sarah stood on her porch watching the last vehicles depart. Ethan sat on the steps beside her, still diligently recording observations in his notebook. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "is our farm going to be famous now?" Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair gently. "Maybe, but more importantly, it's going to help people, lots of people. Like Dad wanted to do with his work." The question caught her by surprise, a bittersweet reminder of Mark's unfulfilled ambitions to apply his engineering skills to humanitarian challenges. "Yes," she said softly, "very much like what Dad wanted." Frank, Tom, and several other farmers remained gathering on her porch as darkness fell. They brought food, a proper meal to replace the hasty breakfast that seemed to have occurred days rather than hours ago. "To Walter Jenkins," Frank proposed as they settled around Sarah's kitchen table, raising a glass in toast, "who protected something precious until the right person came along to share it with the world. And to Sarah," Maggie added, "who had the courage to choose the harder path when easier options were available." Sarah accepted their acknowledgement with humility, aware that their journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: formal documentation for the Senator's initiative, preparation for the Washington meetings, continued cultivation of the test plots, and the everyday work of making an abandoned farm habitable for her small family. But for the first time since Mark's death, the future held promise, rather than just struggle. She had come to Riverside Valley seeking merely affordable shelter and found instead purpose, community, and the chance to create meaningful change. As the conversation around her kitchen table turned to practical matters of spring planting and property improvements, Sarah felt a profound sense of belonging. Walter's hidden legacy had transformed not just her prospects, but her place in the world. The last $500 she'd spent on this neglected farm had purchased far more than property. It had bought her family a home in the truest sense of the word. Later, after everyone had departed and Ethan had finally fallen asleep, Sarah returned to Walter's study and carefully opened the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. The lockbox still contained most of the original seeds and his complete journals, insurance against any future attempts to control or restrict access to his discovery. "We'll do right by your legacy, Walter," she promised quietly, running her fingers over the aged leather of his journal. "These seeds will grow hope, not just crops. From a worn envelope in the box, she withdrew a photograph she hadn't noticed before. A younger Walter Jenkins, standing proudly in a flourishing field, his face alight with the same discovery that now illuminated her own path forward. On the back, written in faded ink, were words that seemed to bridge the decades between his stewardship and hers. To whoever finds this treasure, may you plant not just seeds, but possibilities. May you harvest not just crops, but courage. The earth remembers those who tend it with wisdom and shares its secrets with those who listen. Sarah carefully returned the photo to its place, closed the hidden compartment, and stepped outside, into the cool night air. Above her stretched a canvas of stars, below her feet lay soil with renewal already beginning within it, and around her stood the weathered buildings of a farm no longer abandoned, but awakening to new purpose. Tomorrow would bring government officials, scientific protocols, and the complex dance of collaborative governance. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, Sarah Mitchell simply savored the remarkable truth that by seeking the most modest of dreams, a home for her son, she had stumbled upon something that might help countless others find security and sustenance in an increasingly challenging world. The abandoned farm she'd purchased with her last resources had revealed its true value, not in property, but in possibility. A legacy worth cultivating with the same care Walter had shown for decades, now flourishing in the light of shared stewardship rather than solitary protection. The morning after Senator Harlow's unexpected intervention, Willow Creek Farm buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable to Sarah just days earlier when she'd signed the deed with her last $500. Scientists from 3 different government agencies had established temporary workstations in her barn, cataloging the extraordinary growth patterns of Walter's plants. A security perimeter, subtle but unmistakable, had been established around the property, though Sarah had insisted it remain permeable to local farmers who continued arriving with supplies, food, and moral support. Sarah stood on the porch, with a steaming mug of coffee, watching the sunrise illuminate her transformed property. Beside her, Frank Dawson leaned against the railing, his weathered face thoughtful. "Sleep at all?" he asked, nodding toward the dark circles under her eyes. "A few hours," Sarah admitted. "Too much happening to shut my mind down completely." Frank nodded in understanding. "Big day ahead. Washington officials arriving by noon, according to that aide of Harlow's." The senator had departed the previous evening with promises to return, bringing representatives from the Departments of Agriculture, Defense, and State to formalize the unprecedented collaborative framework she'd proposed. In the meantime, Sarah had been bombarded with information, requests, and thinly veiled attempts from both government and corporate entities to secure privileged access to Walter's discovery. "Mom!" Ethan called from inside the house. "Dr. Garcia says you need to see this." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Frank before hurrying inside. In the kitchen, Dr. Olivia Garcia, the environmental specialist who had arrived with Major Reynolds but had quickly established herself as more scientist than soldier, stood bent over a microscope she'd set up on the table. Several samples of Walter's plants were arranged beside various conventional crops for comparison. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noting the scientist's evident excitement. "The root systems," Dr. Garcia explained, adjusting the microscope. "Look at this." Sarah peered through the eyepiece at a cross-section of roots from one of Walter's plants. Even to her untrained eye, the structure appeared unusual, more complex and densely branched than normal plant roots. "The mycorrhizal network is extraordinary," Dr. Garcia continued. "These plants aren't just growing quickly, they're actively enriching the soil around them through a symbiotic relationship with fungi and bacteria that's unlike anything in our agricultural database." "Meaning?" Sarah prompted, glancing at Ethan, who was absorbing every word with intense curiosity. Meaning these plants don't just survive in poor conditions, they transform those conditions. Preliminary soil samples from your test garden already show measurable increases in nitrogen fixation, microbial diversity, and water retention capacity. Dr. Garcia's professional demeanor briefly gave way to genuine wonder. It's as if they were designed specifically to rehabilitate depleted agricultural environments. Ethan looked up at Sarah, like they're healing the earth, Mom. Exactly like that, Dr. Garcia agreed, smiling at the boy, which makes them potentially revolutionary for areas suffering from soil degradation, drought, or desertification. The implications weren't lost on Sarah. Walter's discovery wasn't just a faster-growing crop, it was potentially a solution to environmental challenges affecting millions of acres worldwide. No wonder both the military and agritech had maintained such persistent interest in the property. Does Reynolds know about this yet? Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Garcia's expression grew more measured. I've included it in my preliminary report. The major is processing the strategic implications. Sarah understood the unspoken message. This new information would only intensify governmental interest in controlling Walter's seeds. The rehabilitative properties represented not just agricultural opportunity, but geopolitical advantage in regions facing environmental collapse. Before she could respond, Frank appeared in the doorway. Visitors coming up the drive, not the senator's people. Different vehicles. Sarah stepped onto the porch just as 3 unmarked SUVs pulled to a stop. The doors opened to reveal men and women in business attire. Led by an imposing figure, Sarah recognized immediately from national news coverage. William Blackwell, director of the newly created Climate Resilience Agency, a cabinet-level position focused on adapting to environmental challenges. Director Blackwell, Sarah greeted him as he approached, hiding her surprise. I wasn't informed you'd be joining today's discussions. Blackwell smiled smoothly. Mrs. Mitchell, when reports of potential breakthrough environmental restoration, technology reach certain levels of government, priorities adjust accordingly. He gestured to his entourage. My team includes specialists in agricultural resilience, climate adaptation, and deployment logistics. We're here to ensure this discovery receives appropriate federal attention. The careful phrasing wasn't lost on Sarah. Appropriate attention could mean many things. Not all of them aligned with the collaborative, community-focused approach Senator Harlow had advocated. The senator outlined a specific framework yesterday, Sarah reminded him. One that balances multiple interests rather than centralizing control. Indeed, Blackwell acknowledged, though something in his tone suggested reservations. Senator Harlow's proposal has merit, but ultimately matters of national adaptation strategy require executive oversight. My agency was created specifically to coordinate such efforts. Frank stepped forward, introducing himself with deceptive casualness. Strange that a cabinet director would personally visit a small farm in our county. Must be quite the priority. The highest, Blackwell confirmed, studying Frank with new interest. Climate resilience isn't just an environmental concern. It's fundamental to national security, economic stability, and social cohesion. Assets that address multiple vulnerability factors simultaneously deserve proportional attention. The conversation might have continued in this diplomatic but tense vein, if not for the rumble of additional vehicles approaching. To Sarah's dismay, Robert Chambers' agritech convoy had returned, this time with what appeared to be legal representatives in tow. And the circus continues, Frank muttered as Chambers emerged, looking momentarily surprised to find Director Blackwell's team already present. Director? Chambers greeted him with practiced cordiality. Agritech wasn't informed of your interest in this matter. nor was the federal government informed of Agritech's surveillance activities regarding potential climate adaptation technologies. Blackwell returned smoothly. Yet, here we all are. The tension between corporate and government interests might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of Senator Harlow's motorcade, pulling in just as the confrontation was building. The senator emerged with her own considerable entourage, immediately taking command of the situation with the practiced authority of a seasoned politician. "Director Blackwell, what an unexpected pleasure," she greeted, though her expression suggested it was neither unexpected nor particularly pleasurable. "I see everyone is eager to begin our collaborative discussion about the Jenkins discovery." She turned to Sarah with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize for this rather overwhelming gathering on your property. Perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere more appropriate than your front yard." Sarah nodded gratefully. The community center in town would have space for everyone. "Frank, could you call ahead and make arrangements?" As Frank made the call, Sarah felt a small hand slip into hers. Ethan had joined her on the porch, watching the assembled officials with a mixture of fascination and uncertainty. "Are they going to take away Walter's plants, Mom?" he asked quietly. Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she promised, though the growing complexity of the situation made her less confident than she tried to sound. Within the hour, an extraordinary gathering had assembled at the Riverside Valley Community Center. The large meeting room, typically used for town gatherings and social events, now hosted an unprecedented convergence of power. Federal officials, corporate executives, scientific experts, and local farmers, all focused on the future of Walter Jenkins' miraculous seeds. Senator Harlow had taken operational control, arranging the room with a large conference table surrounded by additional seating for the expanding group of stakeholders. Sarah found herself positioned at the head of the table alongside the senator, with Ethan stubbornly remaining by her side, despite suggestions that he might prefer to wait elsewhere. "My dad would have wanted me to see this," he'd stated with such conviction that even Director Blackwell had raised an approving eyebrow. "Ladies and gentlemen," Senator Harlow began once everyone was settled, "we're here to determine the appropriate stewardship path for a discovery of potentially historic significance. Before we begin formal discussions, I believe we should all be working from the same factual understanding." She nodded to Dr. Garcia. "Doctor, would you summarize your preliminary findings for the group?" Doodle. Dr. Garcia presented a concise but comprehensive overview of Walter's plants, highlighting their accelerated growth rates, minimal resource requirements, and, most significantly, their apparent ability to actively rehabilitate depleted soil environments through complex microbial interactions. "To be clear," she concluded, "these aren't simply drought-resistant crops. They represent a potential system for environmental restoration that could transform agricultural viability in compromised regions worldwide." The implications hung in the air as various factions processed this confirmation. Director Blackwell leaned forward, his expression intensely focused. "And these properties have been independently verified?" he asked. "Preliminary verification across 20 different test plots established by community members," Dr. Garcia confirmed. "Though comprehensive analysis will require more time, the consistent results suggest the fundamental properties are reproducible." Robert Chambers interjected, which raises immediate questions about intellectual property rights and development protocols. Agricultural innovations of this magnitude typically involve complex patent considerations. "There will be no patents," Sarah stated firmly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. All eyes turned to her. Walter Jenkins discovered these seeds over 40 years ago and deliberately kept them outside commercial and governmental control. I intend to honor that choice." "Mrs. Mitchell," Chambers responded with practiced patience, "while your sentiment is understandable, the reality of modern agricultural development requires structured investment. Without patent protection, companies like Agritech cannot justify the resources needed to scale production and distribution. And without federal oversight," Director Blackwell added, "there's no guarantee these resources would be deployed according to national priority needs. Climate adaptation resources must be aligned with strategic resilience planning." Sarah felt the weight of these powerful interests, attempting to shape the conversation toward their preferred outcomes. She glanced at Ethan, drawing strength from his presence, then looked to Frank and the other farmers who had positioned themselves around the room's perimeter. "Walter Jenkins documented decades of research in journals I've inherited," she said carefully. "He conducted comprehensive trials, recorded genetic observations, and detailed cultivation methods, all while keeping this discovery protected from those who would restrict its benefits through either classification or commercialization." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I understand the arguments for centralized control, whether governmental or corporate, but those arguments prioritize institutional interests over humanitarian ones. These seeds represent a potential solution to food insecurity and environmental degradation affecting millions of people worldwide. Their benefits should be available to all, not controlled by a select few." Director Blackwell frowned. "Mrs. Mitchell, while your idealism is admirable, the practical realities of global agricultural systems require structured deployment. Uncontrolled proliferation of these seeds could lead to ecological disruptions, market destabilization, or exploitation by adversarial nations. And unrestricted access eliminates the economic incentives needed for proper development," Chambers added. "Without patent protection, who would invest in the infrastructure needed to produce these seeds at scale?" Senator Harlow had been observing this exchange with careful attention. Now she raised a hand, refocusing the group. "Both perspectives have merit," she acknowledged. "But perhaps we're creating a false dichotomy. There are models between complete open source access and restrictive patent control." She turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you be opposed to a structured distribution system provided it guaranteed equitable access while preventing exploitation?" Sarah considered this carefully. "I'd need to understand the specifics of such a system. Walter's priority, and mine, is ensuring these benefits reach those who need them most, regardless of their resources or strategic importance." The senator nodded thoughtfully. "What if we established an independent trust, one with balanced governance, including scientific, agricultural, governmental, and community representation? The trust could manage development while ensuring both national security considerations and humanitarian goals are respected." "A trust would still require sustainable funding," Chambers pointed out, though his tone suggested interest rather than dismissal, "which could come from licensing specific applications while keeping the core genetic material and cultivation methods in the public domain," Senator Harlow countered. "Companies like Agritech could develop and patent specialized implementations while paying reasonable royalties to fund continued research and distribution to underserved regions." As the discussion evolved into exploring this middle path approach, Sarah watched the various factions calculating their potential advantages and concessions. Director Blackwell conferred quietly with his team, while Chambers made notes and occasionally consulted with his legal advisors. Frank caught Sarah's eye from across the room and gave her a subtle nod of approval. The trust model, while not perfect, might provide the best achievable balance between protecting Walter's legacy and ensuring its benefits reached beyond Riverside Valley. After nearly 2 hours of increasingly technical discussion about governance, structures, funding mechanisms and distribution protocols, Senator Harlow called for a short break. As the room emptied, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with Ethan at the conference table. "What do you think, Mom?" he asked, his young face serious beyond his years. Would Walter have approved of this trust idea? Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "I think he would have seen it as a compromise, but perhaps a necessary one. He kept these seeds hidden because he didn't trust any single entity to manage them properly. A balanced trust isn't perfect, but it's better than either government classification or corporate control." Ethan nodded solemnly. Dad always said that perfect solutions rarely exist for complex problems. Sarah felt her throat tighten at this echo of Mark's practical wisdom. He did say that, didn't he? And he was right. She squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "The best we can do is create a system with proper checks and balances where no single interest can dominate." Their moment of reflection was interrupted by Major Reynolds, who had been notably quiet during the formal discussions. He approached. With measured steps, his military bearing somewhat softened by what appeared to be genuine respect. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began, "I wanted to speak with you privately for a moment." He glanced at Ethan. Family, privately, that is. Sarah nodded permission, curious about this unexpected approach. "I believe you should know that certain elements within the defense establishment had been monitoring the Jenkins property for years," Reynolds stated without preamble. "Not my division specifically, but adjacent departments with interest in agricultural resilience for deployment zones." "I suspected as much," Sarah acknowledged. "Walter's journals mentioned government interest dating back to the 1970s, Reynolds nodded. "The original observation came during satellite monitoring of unusual growth patterns during the drought of 1979. Jenkins was clever. He destroyed most evidence before the first survey team arrived, but enough anomalies were recorded to maintain periodic surveillance." "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked directly. "Because the trust model Senator Harlow is proposing could work, but only if all parties act in good faith." Reynolds glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Not everyone in my chain of command prioritizes humanitarian applications over strategic advantage. You should be prepared for attempts to influence the trust's governance towards security interests." Sarah studied him, reassessing her initial impression of the Major as simply an institutional functionary. "Why the warning? Yesterday, you were prepared to classify everything about Walter's discovery." Reynolds considered his response carefully. "My assignment was to secure potential assets relevant to national security. Having observed the properties of these plants and considered their potential applications, I've concluded that restricted access would actually undermine their highest value, which is stability," Reynolds answered simply. "Food security and environmental rehabilitation in vulnerable regions represent greater long-term security benefits than any tactical advantage from restricted deployment." He straightened, his posture. "That's my professional assessment, which I'll include in my official report." Before Sarah could respond, the meeting participants began returning from their break. Reynolds nodded respectfully and moved back to his position with the military contingent. As the formal session resumed, Senator Harlow presented a more structured proposal for what she was now calling the Jenkins Agricultural Trust. The framework included balanced representation, transparent governance, public domain status for core discoveries and licensed applications, with revenue supporting both continued research and humanitarian distribution. This approach, she concluded, preserves the public benefit of Walter Jenkins' discovery while addressing legitimate concerns about responsible deployment, national security, and sustainable development. Director Blackwell, after conferring with his team, offered qualified support. The Climate Resilience Agency could work within this framework, provided certain strategic deployment priorities are incorporated into the Trust's charter. Chambers, surprisingly, seemed more receptive than Sarah had anticipated. Agritech recognizes the unique nature of this discovery and the public interest it represents. While we would naturally prefer more conventional intellectual property arrangements, we see potential in developing specialized applications within the trust framework, provided reasonable licensing terms. Das ist ihm. As various stakeholders voiced their perspectives, Sarah became increasingly aware that the conversation had shifted from whether Walter's seeds would be shared to how they would be shared. The trust model, while imperfect, had created a path forward that no faction could entirely reject without appearing to prioritize institutional interest over common good. Frank caught her attention from across the room, giving her a subtle thumbs up. The community representatives were cautiously optimistic, a pragmatic compromise that protected the core principles Walter had valued while creating a sustainable structure for broader impact. When Senator Harlow eventually asked for Sarah's position on the evolving proposal, a hush fell over the room. Despite the power assembled in that community center, everyone recognized that Sarah's inheritance of Walter's discovery gave her unique standing in this negotiation. Sarah took a deep breath, acutely aware of Ethan's presence beside her and the weight of the decision before her. Walter Jenkins protected these seeds for decades because he feared they would be controlled by those who valued power over people, she began. He didn't have the opportunity to create a structure that could protect their benefits while enabling their widespread use. She looked around the room, meeting the gaze of government officials, corporate executives, and local farmers. Alike, the trust framework isn't perfect. No single structure could balance all legitimate interests perfectly. But it represents a genuine attempt to honor Walter's core concern, that these seeds benefit humanity broadly rather than empowering a select few. She placed her hand on Ethan's shoulder. I support the creation of the Jenkins Agricultural Trust, with the conditions that community representation remains equal to governmental and corporate interests, that core genetic material and cultivation methods remain permanently in the public domain, and that a significant portion of all licensing revenue be dedicated to distribution in regions with the greatest need, regardless of their strategic or commercial value. Senator Harlow nodded appreciation. Those conditions align with the trust charter we've been developing. I believe we can incorporate them explicitly to address your concerns. The remainder of the afternoon was devoted to refining specific aspects of the trust structure: governance, procedures, funding mechanisms, research priorities, and deployment protocols. As these discussions became increasingly technical, Sarah found her thoughts drifting to the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. Just days ago, she had been a desperate widow spending her last $500 on an abandoned farm, hoping merely to provide basic shelter for her son after losing everything to medical bills and grief. Now she sat at the center of negotiations that could potentially impact agricultural practices worldwide, surrounded by decision-makers who would normally have been entirely inaccessible to someone in her position. Walter's hidden legacy had transformed not just her circumstances, but her purpose. The teacher who had sought merely to survive was now helping shape how a revolutionary discovery would be shared with the world. As the meeting finally adjourned late in the afternoon, with agreements in principle and commitments to formal legal drafting in the coming days, Sarah found herself momentarily alone in the empty community center. The various delegations had departed for hotels in the nearby city, with promises to reconvene the following day for continued discussions. Frank returned after seeing the last officials out, settling heavily into a chair beside her. Quite a day, he observed with characteristic understatement. Several quite days in a row. Sarah agreed wearily. Is this really happening, Frank? Or will I wake up tomorrow back in our apartment with eviction notices and unpaid bills? Isigia. Older farmer chuckled. It's happening all right, though I expect there'll still be plenty of unpaid bills. Miraculous seeds don't immediately fix leaky roofs or broken tractors. Sarah smiled at the grounding reminder. Whatever broader impact Walter's discovery might have, she still faced the practical challenges of restoring a long-neglected farm with minimal resources. Speaking of which, Frank continued, while you've been negotiating with the powers that be, the community's been talking. We figure that farm of yours needs considerable work before it's properly habitable, especially with all this new attention. Juice? That's putting it mildly, Sarah acknowledged, thinking of the sagging porch, outdated wiring and questionable plumbing that awaited her at Willow Creek Farm. Tom Wilson's brother is a licensed electrician. Maggie's husband does roofing. My nephew has a decent excavator for fixing that drainage issue behind your barn. Frank listed these casually, as if discussing the weather. Figure with about 20 of us working together over the weekend, we could address the most critical issues before all these officials and scientists set up more permanent operations on your property. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Frank, I can't possibly afford to hire all those people, even with whatever compensation eventually comes from the trust. Frank's weathered face creased with genuine amusement. Who said anything about hiring? That's not how we do things around here. When one of our own needs help. But I've only been here a few days, Sarah protested. I'm hardly one of your own. You shared Walter's discovery with the community instead of selling it to Agritech or surrendering it to the government, Frank countered. You've insisted on community representation in the trust governance, and most importantly, he gestured toward the papers documenting their day's negotiations. You've honored your word. That makes you one of us in all the ways that matter. Sarah felt unexpected tears welling in her eyes. After months of struggling alone following Mark's death, the simple offer of community support affected her more deeply than all the high-level negotiations of the day. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes and have coffee ready by 7 Saturday morning, Frank replied practically. And maybe dig out whatever work gloves you might have. Your city hands aren't ready for what we'll be tackling. Sarah laughed despite her exhaustion. Yes, absolutely yes, and thank you. As they walked out of the community center together, the evening sun cast long shadows across the small town square. Ethan was waiting patiently on a bench, still diligently recording observations in the notebook she'd given him that morning. Ready to head home, scientist, she called to him. Ethan looked up with a smile that reminded her painfully of his father. I've documented everything about the meeting for Walter's records, he announced proudly. Dad would have done the same thing. He absolutely would have, Sarah agreed, ruffling his hair as he joined them. And you know what else? The community is coming this weekend to help make the farmhouse more livable. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? Like fixing the porch and the leaky roof and everything? That's the plan, Frank confirmed. Can't have the headquarters of a world-changing agricultural trust falling apart at the seams, can we? As they drove back to Willow Creek Farm in the fading light, Sarah found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt since before Mark's diagnosis. Hope, not just for survival, but for genuine possibility. The last $500 she'd spent on this. Abandoned property had purchased far more than land and buildings. It had connected her to a community, a purpose, and a future neither she nor Ethan could have imagined just days earlier. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she harbored no illusions that the path would be smooth, she would face them not as a desperate widow at the end of her resources, but as the steward of something valuable and the newest member of a community that understood the meaning of mutual support. As they crested the final hill before their farm, the weathered buildings glowed golden in the sunset light. To any casual observer, it still looked like a struggling property on the verge of collapse. But to Sarah, it now represented something altogether different. The unexpected beginning of a new chapter for herself, for Ethan, and potentially for agricultural communities worldwide. Walter Jenkins had waited decades for the right person to discover his hidden legacy. Sarah Mitchell had spent her last $500 seeking merely shelter and found instead a purpose that transcended her most desperate hopes. The abandoned farm that had seemed like a final resort had become the foundation for something neither of them could have fully imagined. A bridge between past wisdom and future possibility, between individual struggle and community resilience. 3 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell spent her last $500 on the abandoned Willow Creek Farm, discovering Walter Jenkins's extraordinary seeds and changing not just her own life, but agricultural practices across multiple continents. The transformation of the once dilapidated property was as remarkable as the story behind it. The Jenkins Agricultural Trust headquarters now occupied a modest but modern building at the edge of Sarah's property, its architecture deliberately designed to blend with the rural landscape rather than dominate it. Solar panels provided most of its energy needs, while carefully designed water systems demonstrated the resource efficiency principles at the heart of the Trust's mission. Sarah stood in the center of her main field, now a vibrant demonstration, plot showcasing the matured versions of Walter's plants, alongside conventional crops for comparison. School groups, agricultural delegations, and scientific teams regularly toured these fields, witnessing firsthand how the once revolutionary seedlings had evolved into established cultivation practices that were gradually transforming agriculture in challenged regions worldwide. "Mom!" Ethan called from the direction of the house. At 13, he'd grown several inches taller since their arrival in Riverside Valley, his lanky frame and serious demeanor reminiscent of his father. The Brazilian delegation is arriving early. Dr. Garcia is already showing them the laboratory equipment. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, taking a final moment to appreciate the healthy soil beneath her feet before heading toward the trust facility. The journey from desperate widow to executive director of an internationally recognized agricultural initiative still occasionally struck her as surreal, especially on days like today when representatives from yet another country arrived seeking solutions to environmental challenges. As she approached the main building, Sarah could see Frank Dawson already greeting the visitors with his characteristic blend of plain-spoken wisdom and practical knowledge. At 71, he had officially retired from active farming 2 years ago, only to immediately accept the position of community liaison for the trust. His weathered face and calloused hands lent authenticity to discussions that might otherwise have become too abstract or theoretical. "There she is," Frank announced as Sarah joined them. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who turned down individual patents worth millions because she believed healthy food shouldn't be a luxury. Sarah accepted the introduction with a gracious smile, having grown accustomed to Frank's deliberate emphasis on the Trust's foundational values whenever new partners arrived. "Welcome to Willow Creek Farm," she greeted the Brazilian agricultural minister and his team. "We're honored to share what we've learned over these past 3 years." The delegation's leader, a distinguished woman with intelligent eyes and practical attire that suggested familiarity with actual farmland rather than just agricultural policy, stepped forward. "Minister Oliveira, the honor is ours, Mrs. Mitchell. Your work has created hope in regions where hope had become scarce." As they walked toward the demonstration fields, Minister Oliveira explained the challenges facing Brazil's northeastern agricultural regions, once productive lands increasingly compromised by changing climate patterns, soil degradation, and water scarcity. It was a story Sarah had heard many times from visitors representing countries across Africa, Asia, South America, and increasingly even North America and Europe. The Trust's regional adaptation program in Colombia has shown promising results. The minister noted, "We're particularly interested in how you've managed to create locally optimized variants while maintaining the core regenerative properties." This had been one of the Trust's most significant innovations, developing region-specific adaptations of Walter's original seeds that maximized effectiveness in different environmental conditions while preserving their fundamental soil healing capabilities. The balanced governance structure which Sarah had insisted upon during those first tense negotiations 3 years ago had proven crucial to this approach. Our adaptation process combines advanced genetic analysis with traditional farming knowledge, Sarah explained, as they reached the research greenhouses. Rather than imposing standardized solutions, we collaborate with local farmers who understand their region's specific challenges. Dr. Olivia Garcia, who had remained in Riverside Valley after those first dramatic days and now served as the Trust's chief science officer, emerged from the nearest greenhouse to join them. Her relationship with Sarah had evolved from cautious, professional respect to genuine friendship and partnership as they navigated the complex challenges of building an organization unlike any that had existed before. "Minister Oliveira," Dr. Garcia greeted her warmly, "I've been reviewing the soil samples your team sent ahead. The degradation patterns are similar to what we've addressed in central Mexico, but with interesting variations in microbial composition." The technical discussion that followed demonstrated how thoroughly science had intertwined with practical application in the Trust's approach. As the delegation moved through various facilities, Sarah occasionally caught glimpses of Ethan leading a separate tour group, a class of local middle school students participating in the educational program he had helped design. Her son had grown into his role as the Trust's unofficial young ambassador with remarkable confidence. His natural curiosity and his father's engineering mindset had combined with Walter Jenkins' legacy to give Ethan a unique perspective that bridged generations and disciplines. At 13, he already understood agricultural systems with more depth than many college graduates. The afternoon's formal tour concluded in the Trust's modest conference room, where regional implementation plans were discussed in practical detail. Unlike many international agricultural initiatives, the Jenkins Trust focused on training and empowerment rather than dependency. Communities received not just adapted seeds, but comprehensive education in the cultivation methods and system maintenance that would allow them to become self-sufficient within 3 growing seasons. "Your approach differs significantly from conventional agricultural development models," Minister Oliveira observed as their meeting concluded. "Most organizations emphasize either technology transfer or traditional methods. You've created a genuine synthesis." Walter Jenkins spent decades documenting how these plants functioned, Sarah acknowledged. But he also understood that technological innovation without community wisdom rarely succeeds long-term. We've tried to honor both aspects of his legacy. As the Brazilian delegation departed with preliminary agreements for a northeastern regional program, Sarah found herself momentarily alone in the conference room. The wall behind her desk displayed photographs documenting the Trust's global impact. Farmers in drought-stricken regions of Kenya harvesting their first substantial crops. In years, community celebrations in rural India, where previously abandoned fields now supported diverse cultivation. Scientific teams from major research universities analyzing soil samples from regenerated agricultural zones. Alongside these professional milestones were more personal images, the community barn raising that had replaced her dilapidated outbuildings that first summer. Ethan proudly displaying his first harvest from the kitchen garden, and a framed copy of the Jenkins Agricultural Trust Charter with its carefully balanced governance structure that prevented any single interest, governmental, corporate, or academic, from controlling Walter's legacy. A knock at the door interrupted her reflection. Tom Wilson entered, still dressed in work clothes from his own farm, which had become one of the Trust's primary regional testing grounds. "Meeting go well?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her with the easy familiarity of a close friend. "Very well," Sarah confirmed. "Brazil makes 17 countries now with active implementation programs, and their agricultural ministry is considering national policy changes based on our regenerative model." Tom nodded with satisfaction. "Walter would be proud, though I expect he'd be a bit overwhelmed by all this." He gestured to indicate the organization that had grown around the seeds Walter had hidden decades earlier. "Probably," Sarah agreed, with a smile. "He kept his discovery secret because he couldn't see a path to sharing it safely. I doubt he imagined anything on this scale." "Speaking of scale," Tom said, his expression growing more serious, "Maggie asked me to remind you about tonight's community council. They're voting on the expansion proposal for the processing facility." Sarah checked her watch with a grimace. Between the Brazilian delegation and tomorrow's scheduled call with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, she had nearly forgotten the local meeting. "Thanks for the reminder. It wouldn't look good if the Trust's director missed a vote on our own community integration plan." The Trust's relationship with Riverside Valley represented another balancing act in Sarah's complex role. While the organization's work had gained international recognition, she had insisted from the beginning that its primary accountability remained to the local community where Walter had made his discovery. The processing facility expansion would create additional local jobs while increasing the Trust's seed production capacity for global distribution. Precisely the kind of mutually beneficial development Sarah had envisioned from the start. As Tom departed, Sarah took a moment to switch mentally from international diplomacy to local community matters. The transition had become familiar over the past 3 years as she navigated between global impact and neighborly responsibility. A text message from Ethan appeared on her phone. "Finished student tour. Frank says bring apple pie to council meeting. I'll get one from Mrs. Cooper." Sarah smiled at this routine reminder of how thoroughly they had become integrated into community life. Maggie Cooper's apple pies had become an expected contribution from the Mitchell family at local gatherings, a small tradition that meant more to Sarah than many of the high-profile recognitions the Trust had received. The drive into town that evening revealed how Riverside Valley itself had transformed alongside Willow Creek Farm. New businesses had opened on the main street, including a farm-to-table restaurant that sourced ingredients from local farms now. Thriving with Walter's agricultural methods, the community center had been expanded with a new wing dedicated to agricultural education, funded partly by the Trust and partly by community fundraising. What struck Sarah most, however, was what hadn't changed. Despite the economic revitalization, Riverside Valley retained its essential character, a close-knit agricultural community where neighbors supported each other through challenges and celebrated collective successes. The influx of researchers, international visitors, and agricultural students had been absorbed without fundamentally altering the town's identity. The community council meeting exemplified this balance. Formal discussion of the processing facility expansion, with its technical specifications and economic projections, was interspersed with updates on Mrs. Johnson's recovery from hip surgery, plans for the Fall Harvest Festival, and debate about necessary repairs to the high school gymnasium roof. When the expansion project came up for formal vote, Sarah presented the Trust's perspective with the same careful attention she would have given to a presentation for government officials or corporate partners. The proposal passed unanimously, with council members expressing appreciation for the Trust's continued commitment to local employment and community integration. As the meeting concluded and people gathered in small conversational groups, Robert Chambers approached Sarah. The Agritech CEO's relationship with the Trust had evolved in unexpected ways over the years. After initially opposing the open-source approach to Walter's seeds, Chambers had eventually recognized potential in developing specialized equipment and complementary technologies that worked with the Trust's plants without controlling them directly. "Congratulations on the Brazil initiative," he said, his corporate polish tempered by what appeared to be genuine respect. "Their agricultural ministry has traditionally been resistant to outside partnerships. They're facing serious challenges," Sarah acknowledged. "Sometimes necessity overcomes institutional caution." Chambers nodded thoughtfully. "Agritech's board has been reviewing our 3-year collaboration with the Trust. The specialized cultivation equipment we've developed has opened markets we hadn't anticipated." "I noticed your company's stock has performed well," Sarah observed, neutrally. "Very well," Chambers confirmed with a hint of his former corporate intensity, "which validates what I've been arguing since our first collaborative projects. Genuine sustainability and profitability aren't inherently opposed when the business model is properly structured." This represented significant evolution from Chambers's initial position that Walter's seeds required conventional patent protection to justify investment. The licensing framework Senator Harlow had helped establish, where core technology remained in the public domain while specialized applications could be developed commercially, had proven more economically viable than many corporate analysts had predicted. "The Trust's 5-year review conference is next month," Sarah mentioned. "We'd welcome Agritech's perspective on how the collaborative model has performed from a business standpoint." "I'll be there," Chambers assured her, along with representatives from several other agricultural technology firms interested in similar partnership structures. This perhaps represented the most unexpected outcome of the path Sarah had chosen 3 years earlier. Rather than simply protecting Walter's discovery from exploitation, the Trust had begun to influence how major corporations approached agricultural innovation more broadly. Several leading firms had introduced their own open-source initiatives, recognizing the market and reputational benefits of more collaborative approaches to global challenges. As Sarah drove home later that evening with Ethan beside her, the headlights illuminated new growth along the roadside. Native plants returning to areas that had been barren for years, their recovery supported by the improved soil conditions radiating from fields where Walter's plants now grew. "Dr. Garcia says the soil microbiome has spread almost 3 miles beyond our actual cultivation areas," Ethan commented, following her gaze. "The regenerative effect is accelerating as the system establishes itself." Walter documented something similar in his journals, Sarah recalled. He called it nature remembering itself, as if the land had been waiting for the right conditions to heal. They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Ethan spoke again. "Mom, do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found Walter's seeds, if we'd just fixed up the farm normally?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes. We would have struggled, certainly, but I believe we would have found our place in the community eventually. But without the Trust, without all this," Ethan gestured to indicate the broader impact their lives had taken. "We would have had a smaller life," Sarah acknowledged. "But smaller doesn't necessarily mean less meaningful. The seeds changed our path dramatically, but the important parts, finding community, creating something sustainable, honoring your father's memory through how we live, those could have happened in many ways." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. At 13, he was increasingly reflective about the unusual circumstances that had shaped his young life. Walter waited decades for the right person to find his discovery. He could have told people sooner, but he didn't. He was waiting for the right conditions, Sarah agreed, just like his plants needed the right conditions to thrive. As they turned onto the long drive leading to Willow Creek Farm, the trust headquarters came into view, its few evening lights glowing softly against the darkening sky. Beyond it stood their home, the farmhouse that community members had helped renovate that first summer, now comfortable and well-maintained, but deliberately kept modest despite the trust's success. Inside, Sarah found a message on her secure line from Major Reynolds, who had remained an unexpected ally through the trust's development. Now serving as military liaison to the Climate Resilience Agency, Reynolds had helped navigate the complex security considerations surrounding Walter's discovery, while consistently advocating for its humanitarian applications. Satellite monitoring confirmed successful regeneration in North African test region. His message reported, delegation from 3 additional countries requesting emergency implementation support. Classified security assessment upgraded to critical stabilization asset for drought-affected regions. Authorization for expanded military logistical support pending approval. This represented another dimension of the trust's impact that would have been difficult to imagine 3 years ago. Walter's seeds had gradually transformed from potential security asset to actual stability factor in regions where environmental degradation threatened not just agriculture, but social cohesion and geopolitical stability. As Sarah prepared her response to Reynolds, she reflected on how fundamentally her perspective had evolved since those first tense days of military inspections and corporate interest. What had initially appeared as threats to Walter's legacy had ultimately become channels for its broader impact when properly balanced within the trust's carefully designed governance structure. Late that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of tea, gazing across fields that glowed softly under the full moon, the same view that had greeted her when she arrived with nothing but desperate hope, and her last $500 now represented something she could never have anticipated. Not just personal security for herself and Ethan, but a living legacy that extended far beyond Riverside Valley. Frank's pickup truck turned into her drive, unusual for this late hour. She waited as he parked and made his way to the porch, moving more slowly these days, but with the same purposeful determination. "Thought you might still be up," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Too many things happening to sleep properly, I expect." Sarah smiled in acknowledgement. Brazilian delegation, community council meeting, and the UN presentation to prepare for tomorrow. Sleep feels somewhat optional. Frank nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket. "Found something today I thought you should have. Was going through some old boxes in my attic, came across this." He handed her a faded photograph. In the porch, light, Sarah could make out 2 men standing beside a tractor. A much younger Frank Dawson and Walter Jenkins, both smiling at the camera. "Harvest of '83, Frank explained. "One of the drought years when everyone else's crops failed. Walter helped me plant a small section with his special seeds. Didn't tell me exactly what they were, just said they were experimental. Saved my farm that year, though we kept it quiet to avoid questions." Sarah studied the photograph with reverence. "You never mentioned that he shared the seeds with you. Never saw the full extent of what he was developing," Frank clarified. "Just that limited planting when my family was desperate. Made me promise not to ask questions or tell anyone where the unusual crop came from." He paused, looking out over the moonlit fields. "That's how I knew when you found his journals that you were doing right by his legacy. Walter helped people, but quietly, carefully, not for recognition, just because it was right." The photograph represented another thread connecting past to present, reinforcing the continuity between Walter's solitary stewardship and the global impact his discovery now created through the trust. "The 5-year review next month will be crucial," Sarah said after a comfortable silence. "Some board members are pushing for more aggressive expansion, particularly in commercial applications." Frank considered this thoughtfully. Growth is natural, but Walter understood the value of patience. These plants don't just grow fast, they regenerate ecosystems by working with what's already there, building relationships between species. He gave her a meaningful look. "Kind of like what you've done with the trust itself." Sarah appreciated the analogy. From the beginning, she had structured the organization to function as an ecosystem rather than a conventional hierarchy, balancing scientific research, practical application, community wisdom, and careful governance in a system where no single element dominated. "We've accomplished more than I ever imagined possible," she acknowledged, "but maintaining the right balance as we grow becomes more challenging with each new partnership." "That's why Walter chose you," Frank said simply. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "He didn't choose me. He died years before I purchased the farm." "He chose you by how he left things," Frank clarified. "He could have destroyed all evidence of his discovery, could have left clearer instructions or told more people. Instead, he created a test, a hidden legacy that required someone with both the desperation to try something unconventional and the integrity to use it wisely." This perspective on Walter's decades-long silence had never occurred to Sarah. She had viewed his secrecy primarily as fear of exploitation, rather than as an intentional waiting for the right steward. "That's quite a responsibility to place on someone who was just looking for affordable housing," she observed, with a hint of irony. Frank chuckled. "The most important responsibilities rarely announce themselves in advance. They tend to find us when we're busy making other plans." As he departed a short while later, Sarah remained on the porch, considering Frank's perspective alongside the day's events. From desperate widow spending her last $500 on an abandoned farm to director of an organization transforming agricultural practices globally, the journey still occasionally seemed impossibly dramatic. Yet the core elements had remained consistent throughout. A commitment to balancing competing interests, insistence on community benefit alongside global impact, and determination to honor the careful stewardship Walter Jenkins had maintained for decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the UN presentation, ongoing research complications, and the diplomatic complexities of expanding into regions with different agricultural traditions and governance structures. The Trust's growth created constant pressure to compromise its founding principles for expedience or efficiency. But tonight, sitting on the porch of what had once been an abandoned farmhouse she'd purchased in desperation, Sarah felt the profound rightness of the path that had unfolded from that seemingly hopeless beginning. Walter's hidden legacy had transformed not just her circumstances, but her understanding of what was possible when desperation met opportunity and short-term survival expanded into long-term vision. The seeds that had brought military intelligence to her door overnight 3 years ago now sprouted hope in communities across continents. The farm she had purchased with her last resources now anchored an organization that balanced scientific innovation, community wisdom, and global responsibility in service of a more resilient agricultural future. As the clock approached midnight, Sarah finally rose and went inside, leaving the porch light on, a habit she had maintained since those first uncertain nights on the property. It served as both a practical guide for late returns and a symbol of the welcome she had found in Riverside Valley when she had nowhere else to turn. In the study that had once been Walter's, now lined with both his journals and the growing documentation of the Trust's global impact, Sarah paused beside the repaired floorboards that had concealed his momentous discovery. The original lockbox remained sealed within its hiding place, a private insurance policy against any future attempt to control or restrict the legacy she now stewarded. "We're doing our best by your discovery, Walter," she said softly to the empty room. "Growing it thoughtfully, letting it heal what's broken, just as you hoped it would. From that hidden beginning had grown something Walter Jenkins could likely never have imagined. Not just rehabilitated fields and renewed harvests, but a fundamentally different approach to agricultural innovation that emphasized collaboration over control, regeneration over extraction, and community benefit over institutional advantage. The last $500 Sarah Mitchell had spent on an abandoned farm had purchased not just shelter, but purpose. A legacy that continued to unfold in ways neither she nor Walter could have fully anticipated, but would have recognized as fertile ground. For hope, up next you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.